In 2015, Ireland's economy grew by 26%. 26% in a single year. That's not a typo. To put that in perspective, China during its most explosive growth phase averaged 10%. The post-war economic miracles of Japan and Germany peaked around 12%. Ireland supposedly grew at more than double that rate. Did Irish workers suddenly become twice as productive overnight? Did factories spring up across Dublin? Did Ireland discover oil? No. What happened was an accounting trick. Apple moved some intellectual property to Ireland for tax reasons. On paper, Ireland's GDP exploded. In reality, nothing changed for Irish people. No new jobs, no new production. Just numbers on a spreadsheet that made the country look like an economic rocket ship. Economists called it leprechaun economics. Even Ireland's central bank admitted the figures were meaningless. This isn't an isolated quirk. This is what GDP actually is. A number so easily manipulated, so disconnected from human welfare that it tells you almost nothing about how a country is actually doing. Today, I'm going to show you how the world's most important economic metric is essentially a fraud, how every major country games it, how it hides more than it reveals, and why we keep using it anyway. Welcome to the scam that runs the world. 1. What GDP actually measures. Let's start with what GDP is supposed to measure. Gross domestic product is the total monetary value of all goods and services produced within a country in a given period. It's meant to capture economic activity. More GDP equals more activity equals more prosperity. That's the theory. The formula is straightforward. Add up all consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. The result is a single number that supposedly tells you how an economy is performing. This number determines everything. Credit ratings depend on GDP. Countries with higher GDP get lower interest rates on their debt. Countries with lower GDP pay more. International status depends on GDP. The G7, G20, who gets a seat at the table, all determined by this number. Political survival depends on GDP. Leaders who deliver GDP growth get re-elected. Leaders who don't get thrown out. So naturally, everyone games it. 2. The Ireland trick, profit without production. Let me explain what actually happened in Ireland. Ireland has one of the lowest corporate tax rates in Europe. Multinational corporations, especially tech and pharma companies, route profits through Irish subsidiaries to minimize taxes. In 2015, several major corporations restructured their intellectual property holdings. They moved trademarks, patents, and other intangibles to Irish subsidiaries. On paper, these assets were now in Ireland. The profits generated by these assets, billions in royalties from around the world, showed up as Irish production. Ireland's GDP jumped 26%. But no new factories were built, no new workers were hired, no new products were made in Ireland. Irish wages didn't increase 26%. Irish living standards didn't improve 26%. What happened was an accounting fiction. Corporate profits passed through Ireland on their way to shareholders. Ireland got to claim them as GDP. This isn't unique to Ireland. Luxembourg's GDP per capita is over $125,000, making it one of the richest countries in the world by this metric. The reason? It's a financial pass-through for European banking. Money flows in and out without creating corresponding wealth for Luxembourgers. The Netherlands, Singapore, Hong Kong all have inflated GDPs because of their roles as corporate and financial hubs. The activity is real in an accounting sense. It's fake in a human welfare sense. 3. The China question, building to nowhere. China's GDP growth has been the economic story of the century. 30 years of near double-digit growth, hundreds of millions lifted from poverty, the most dramatic development in human history. But how much of China's GDP is real? Here's how GDP accounting works. If you build a building, it counts as GDP when it's built. It doesn't matter if anyone ever uses the building. The construction activity is what gets counted. China has built a lot of buildings no one uses. Ghost cities, entire metropolitan areas with skyscrapers, shopping malls, and apartment complexes that sit empty. Ordos, built for 1 million residents, that housed a fraction of that. Kangbashi, a showcase city that became famous for its vacant streets. Roads to nowhere, highways that see minimal traffic, bridges that connect nothing to nothing, infrastructure built to hit GDP targets rather than to serve actual need. Apartments as investments. Chinese households have poured savings into real estate not to live in but to store value. These apartments are bought, never occupied, and counted as GDP when constructed. None of this is secret. Chinese economists acknowledge it. The question is, how much of China's reported GDP represents this kind of economically meaningless activity? Academic estimates vary widely. Some suggest that 20–30% of Chinese construction investment has been malinvested, built in places where demand doesn't justify it. If true, Chinese GDP would be significantly lower than reported. And there's the data reliability issue. Provincial officials in China have been incentivized to meet GDP targets. Their careers depend on growth numbers. Unsurprisingly, provincial GDP figures, when added up, consistently exceed national GDP. Someone is inflating their numbers. China's central government has tried to crack down on fake statistics. But when your entire governance system is built around hitting a metric, that metric will be gamed. It's not Chinese culture. It's universal human behavior. 4. The American illusion. Imputed value. Surely the United States has reliable GDP figures, right? The most sophisticated statistical system in the world? Let me tell you about imputed rent. American GDP includes the estimated rental value of owner-occupied housing. If you own your home and live in it, statisticians calculate how much rent you would have paid if you were renting and add that to GDP. This is called imputed rent. It adds about $2 trillion to US GDP annually. That's roughly 8% of the entire economy. No money changes hands. No economic activity occurs. It's a statistical adjustment designed to make GDP comparable across countries with different home ownership rates. But it means 8% of American GDP is literally imaginary, a made-up number added to make the statistics work. It gets weirder. Healthcare spending counts as GDP regardless of outcomes. The US spends nearly 18% of GDP on healthcare, far more than any other developed country. But American health outcomes, life expectancy, infant mortality are mediocre by developed country standards. More spending equals more GDP, even when that spending is wasteful. Every unnecessary procedure, every overpriced drug, every administrative inefficiency, it all counts as economic activity. Getting sick is good for GDP. Defense spending counts as GDP. When the US builds a missile that sits in a silo and is never used, that's GDP. When it builds a missile that's fired and must be replaced, that's even more GDP. War is fantastic for the number. The US spends about 3.5% of GDP on defense. That's $850 billion annually that, whatever its strategic merits, doesn't improve American living standards. You can't eat a tank, but the tank counts. Financial services count as GDP. When a bank creates complex derivatives that eventually blow up the economy, the fees charged count as GDP. The 2008 crisis was preceded by years of GDP growth driven partly by financial engineering that proved worthless. 5. The statistical dark arts. Let me show you some specific techniques countries use to inflate GDP, rebasing and revisions. Countries periodically update how they calculate GDP. This is legitimate, as methodologies improve, but it also provides cover for upward revisions. Nigeria rebased its GDP in 2014. Overnight, the economy grew by 89%. Nigeria became Africa's largest economy. Nothing changed on the ground. Ghana rebased in 2010 and found 60% more economy than previously measured. These revisions are technically defensible. They capture previously unmeasured activity, but they're also suspiciously convenient, and they always seem to go in one direction. Shadow economy estimation. Some countries include estimates of informal and illegal economic activity. Italy famously added prostitution and drug dealing to its GDP calculation in 2014. This added 1 to 2% to the total. Is illegal activity economic activity? Technically, yes, but counting it is guesswork, and the guesses conveniently make the numbers look better. Quality adjustments. When a product improves in quality, statisticians adjust its price downward to reflect the improvement. Your new laptop costs $1,000 but is twice as powerful as your old laptop. Statisticians might count it as if you'd bought $500 of laptop and $500 of free improvement. This is called hedonic adjustment. It's meant to account for technological progress, but it's also subjective, and it can inflate real GDP growth significantly. The US uses hedonic adjustments heavily, especially for technology products. Other countries use them less. This makes cross-country comparisons questionable. Government spending accounting. Government services are valued at cost since there's no market price. If the government hires more bureaucrats, GDP rises. It doesn't matter if the bureaucrats are productive or if anyone wanted their services. This incentivizes government expansion regardless of value. More spending equals more GDP, full stop. 6. What GDP misses. Even if GDP were perfectly measured, it would still miss what actually matters. Unpaid work disappears. A parent who raises children at home contributes nothing to GDP. If that same parent pays someone else for childcare and gets a job, GDP rises twice. Once for the childcare service, once for the new job. GDP systematically undervalues care work, household production, and community activity. These are enormous economic contributions that simply don't count. Environmental destruction is positive. If a company clear-cuts a forest and sells the timber, GDP rises. The forest's ecological services, clean air, water filtration, carbon storage, biodiversity aren't counted. When they're destroyed, GDP doesn't notice. If a factory pollutes a river and then a cleanup company is hired to address it, both the production and the cleanup count as GDP. The pollution itself costs nothing in the statistics. Economic growth that destroys the environment looks identical to sustainable growth. GDP can't tell the difference. Inequality is invisible. GDP measures total output. It says nothing about distribution. A country where one person has everything and everyone else has nothing could have the same GDP as a country where wealth is broadly shared. The metric can't distinguish between them. This matters because human welfare depends heavily on distribution, not just total size. A larger pie that you don't get to eat doesn't help you. Quality of life doesn't register. Leisure time doesn't count. If people work less and enjoy life more, GDP falls. The statistic treats all non-market activity as valueless. Mental health doesn't count. A society where everyone is stressed and anxious but productive has higher GDP than a relaxed society with more free time. Community and social connection don't count. Strong neighborhoods, civic engagement, and social trust are invisible to GDP. 7. The Greek tragedy. Let me tell you how GDP gaming can lead to catastrophe. Greece joined the Eurozone in 2001 based partly on its economic statistics. To qualify, it needed to meet certain criteria: deficit levels, debt ratios, economic stability. Greece's statistics were later found to be fraudulent. The government had systematically underreported deficits and manipulated economic data. Goldman Sachs had helped design financial structures that hid debt from official accounts. On paper, Greece qualified. In reality, it didn't. When the truth emerged during the 2010 crisis, the consequences were devastating. Greece's economy contracted by 25%. Unemployment hit 27%. Youth unemployment exceeded 50%. A generation was scarred. The fraudulent statistics weren't just accounting errors. They enabled the borrowing binge that created the crisis. Lenders trusted numbers that were lies. Greece is an extreme example, but the dynamic is universal. When countries are judged by GDP and related statistics, they have overwhelming incentives to make those statistics look good by any means necessary. 8. The Goodhart problem. There's a principle in economics called Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. GDP has become the ultimate target. Everything is optimized for it, and in the process, it has stopped measuring what it was supposed to measure. Countries don't pursue human welfare and hope GDP reflects it. Countries pursue GDP directly and hope human welfare follows. These are not the same thing. Building a ghost city raises GDP. Building a community that meets human needs might not. An expensive, inefficient healthcare system raises GDP. A cheap, effective one doesn't. Environmental destruction raises GDP. Sustainability doesn't. When the metric becomes the goal becomes the metric, and the original purpose gets lost. 9. What would be better? If GDP is flawed, what should we measure instead? Economists and governments have proposed alternatives. The Human Development Index, HDI, combines life expectancy, education, and income. It's a broader measure of welfare than GDP alone. Countries like Cuba and Costa Rica rank much higher on HDI than their GDP would predict. The Genuine Progress Indicator, GPI, adjusts GDP for inequality, environmental damage, and other factors. By this measure, American welfare peaked in the 1,970 and has been flat or declining since, even as GDP grew. Bhutan's gross national happiness attempts to measure subjective well-being, environmental sustainability, and cultural preservation alongside economic factors. The OECD Better Life Index lets users weight different factors, including housing, jobs, community, health, and life satisfaction, to create personalized welfare measures. None of these is perfect. All face measurement challenges, but they at least attempt to capture what GDP ignores. The problem isn't technical, we could measure better. The problem is political. GDP serves powerful interests precisely because it's gameable and because it counts economic activity regardless of its human value. 10. Why we're stuck. If GDP is so flawed, why does everyone still use it? Simplicity. GDP is one number. It goes up or down. Anyone can understand it. Alternative measures are complex and multidimensional. They don't fit in headlines. Politicians need simple metrics. GDP grew 3% is a talking point. The weighted average of 17 well-being indicators adjusted for sustainability rose modestly is not. Comparability. Every country calculates GDP roughly the same way. International comparisons are possible, even if they're misleading. Alternative measures often can't be compared across countries because different countries value different things. Inertia. Trillions of dollars in financial decisions are based on GDP. Credit ratings, bond yields, investment allocations, all tied to GDP statistics. Changing the system would disrupt enormous interests. Convenience for elites. GDP counts economic activity regardless of who benefits. A country where all gains go to the top 1% looks just as good as one where gains are broadly shared. This is useful for people at the top. They can point to GDP growth while living standards for most people stagnate. The number provides cover. Conclusion. The number that blinds. Here's what I want you to understand. When a politician tells you GDP is growing, they're telling you something. They're just not telling you much. They're not telling you if your life is getting better. They're not telling you if the gains are shared. They're not telling you if the environment is being destroyed. They're not telling you if the growth is real or an accounting trick. They're telling you a number went up, a number that can be manipulated, that misses most of what matters, and that measures activity regardless of whether it serves human welfare. Ireland's 26% growth was fake. China's ghost cities are real GDP but wasted resources. America's imputed rent and bloated healthcare spending inflate a number that doesn't reflect lived experience. GDP is not a scam in the sense that people made it up to deceive. It was designed for a specific purpose in 1934, measuring economic activity, and it does that reasonably well. But GDP is a scam in the sense that it's used to tell a story it can't actually tell. The story of human progress, the story of national success, the story that growth equals welfare. That story is false, and the people who benefit most from the current system have every incentive to keep telling it. The next time someone cites GDP growth, ask, growth for whom? Growth of what? At what cost? Because the number itself won't tell you. If this analysis made you question numbers you'd taken for granted, hit that subscribe button. Because understanding how statistics mislead is the first step to seeing through the stories we're told. See you in the comments. And remember, the most powerful lies are the ones backed by official data.